Welcome everyone to this ECGI Spotlight Seminar on the power of the narrative in corporate lawmaking by Mark Rowe and Roy Shapira. I'm Amir Licht, and together with me is Geeyoung, who is the co-editor of the ECGI Spotlight Legal Seminars. The topic of our seminar event could not be more timely. Just about a month ago, on February 23rd, the European Commission adopted a proposal for a directive on corporate governance sustainability due diligence. And just last week, the ECGI and the Stockholm School of Economics held a two-day workshop on this very proposal. The proposed directive, as some of you may know, is the product of an earlier initiative that's called the Sustainable Corporate Governance Initiative. When you look at the materials of that initiative, it starts by saying that this initiative aims to improve the EU regulatory framework on corporate law and corporate governance. It would enable companies to focus on long-term sustainable value creation rather than short-term benefits, and so on and so forth. The initiative morphed into something different a little bit, at least at first glance, which is the proposed Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And when you look at that proposal, then the introductory materials, at least, seem to have been cleansed of any reference to short-term or long-term issues. But when you dig just a little bit deeper in the background materials, we find the same old themes. So there's in the Q&A, there's the questions: what are directors obliged to do, and how will their duties be enforced? The Commission answers. The directive also introduces duties for the directors of the EU companies that it covers. These duties include, and so on. In addition, when directors act in the interest of the company, they must take into account this and that, and the likely consequences of any decision in the long term. Companies have duly to take into account the fulfillment obligations in setting the remuneration linked to the contribution of directors to the company's business strategy and long-term interest. You got it, right? As I said, short-termism is alive and well, and our seminar could not have been more timely. I'm very glad to introduce Mark Rowe and Roy Shapira, the co-authors of this paper. Mark, from Harvard Law School, belongs to the the group of people who need no introduction. He works on corporate governance and is well known. Roy is a colleague and good friend at Reichman University. He belongs to the category of people who will need no introduction. He works on corporate governance and corporate law as well, and focuses on law and reputation. Before turning the floor to our speakers, I would like to thank Noreen and Khan and Elaine McPartland from ECGI for shepherding us and making this event possible. Mark, Roy, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the organizers for inviting us to do this. Roy and I do greatly appreciate this. So let me give you an overview of what we're doing, and then some detail. I'll do, I guess, the bulk of this presentation, but then for the last key points, Roy's going to take over and conclude. So the motivation here for us is that lots of corporate law is really made out of the public eye. It's the litigants, the judges, the regulators, occasionally the legislators, but public opinion, at least in its direct formation, is not very critical. So the appraisal remedy, for example, has been important in corporate lawmaking over the last 10 years. There's no evidence that legislators know what the appraisal remedy is, much less have an opinion as to what the appraisal remedy should do. But there's a range of issues where the public has a view. And for some of those issues where the public has a view, this is going to have an impact on corporate lawmaking. And these issues quite plausibly are increasing. More populism, media density, social media make things more possible than before to grab a hold, not of the whole polity, but of significant portions of the polity. So let me see if I can share some slides, and let me. So you should see our title slide. Okay, power of the narrative in corporate law, corporate lawmaking. So public attention is going to influence lawmakers through two paths. One, through public opinion itself. So lawmakers are responsive to public opinion because public opinion is going to put them where they are. It's going to have an indirect effect on judges and regulators because lawmakers put the judges and regulators in place. And it's going to have another channel into lawmaking in that it's going to affect the views that the lawmakers themselves come to have. We've identified about a half dozen issues in which there is a public perspective on the issue. Corporate purpose, ESG, big stuff from the last few years. Executive compensation, intermittently, maybe a little dormant now. Hostile takeovers, particularly in the 1980s. Stock buybacks, and the topic for today, short-termism. So, in a world where Ukraine, inflation, COVID dominates the headlines, we'd hardly say that these are the headline issues, but they're issues that engage enough of the public that there's a potential for significant public influence and influence on the way lawmakers who are not diligently reading the Journal of Finance and the Journal of Financial Economics for data and impression can be influenced. Thesis is that stock market driven short-termism is seen, to the extent the public has a view, to be quite detrimental to the overall economy and to be quite widespread. It's been especially so in the US over the last decades. And as Amir said, it's been important in significant EU lawmaking initiatives. It's one of the very few corporate governance issues that engages major league politicians. So Joe Biden has things to say about stock market driven short-termism. I'll put a quote on in a moment. Hillary Clinton had it as one of the issues of the 2020 campaign. My former colleague, Elizabeth Warren, inveighs against stock market short-termism regularly. Donald Trump tweeted against quarterly reporting as having a pernicious effect at one point, and the SEC diligently then, in response, held some hearings. So the focus of our work here is, why is this one of the corporate law issues that's highly salient with the public? Not what's its academic truth. Its academic truth is important, but truth is only one of the things that plays into whether an issue is going to be salient with the public. And here there's an aspect. If you just go down and pick out, as I did at one point, just all of the articles on stock market short-termism in the leading finance and economics journals, it's sharply divided, nearly really 50-50. And if you were just reading the articles with no prior conceptualization, it would be hard to come to a conclusion of certainty one way or the other. But in public discourse, there's substantial certainty that stock market short-termism, to the extent anybody is paying attention to it, is quite serious, quite detrimental, and quite widespread. Narrative analysis. Our view is that narrative analysis can help inform us why a corporate issue bursts out from just corporate universe to the public sphere. Narrative analysis, here we've got a list of, here's Robert Schulte, Narrative Economics. You can tell from the title. George Akerlof has an article on the subject. David Hirschleifer in Presidential Address to the AFA, Social Transmission Bias. They're all starting to focus on narrative analysis. So you can see from the list, 2 Nobel Prize winners, 1 AFA president. I think we're behind in corporate law analysis on narrative analysis. It's soft, it's difficult to come to grips with, but it's really hardly present at all in corporate law thinking. You can really only get to it with some cousins to the idea. So our paper is exploratory. We're advancing a hypothesis that narrative analysis is important. We tap into behavioral economics, see how the narrative analysis can be congruent with interest groups' goals. But for the most part, this is exploratory. We've got some content analysis, empirics from blog posts, from media coverage, and from a close look at how dictionaries look at the connotation of these keywords. And we've been doing, but not reported in the paper, some empirics on attitudes towards stock market short-termism, and the preliminary results are quite supportive of the thesis. We should say somewhere in here that people who we're not going to hide the ball on this. We tend to think that stock market driven short-termism in terms of a time horizon problem for the large public corporation is oversold as a deeply pernicious problem. But that's not the subject of this paper. The subject of this paper is why it has a public profile when so many other corporate things do not have a public profile. But we think people who do think that the public view of stock market driven short-termism is correct, that it's real, it's wide, and it's deeply pernicious, should still be quite interested in understanding and maybe working with us on figuring out what the right narrative analysis is. Because there are so many good ideas that we have in academia, and sometimes we have a deep and wide consensus, and the idea never makes it out of the ivory tower to the political sphere. So the question we have is, why is this one of the ideas that has a public profile at significant junctures? And we've got some answers, hypotheses, things with some evidence that are worth looking at. And the idea is connotation. Before we do much analysis with the words, short-termism just seems inherently negative and pernicious to most people. And long-termism seems inherently positive to most people. Yet from a finance perspective, if we were doing a net present value calculation, it's not so obvious that the 2-year plan is better than the 10-year plan. But in the public reaction, short-termism is bad, long-termism is good. There's category confusion. There are a whole lot of things out there, mostly externalities, occasionally information and asymmetries that have the feel of being time horizon issues. But when we just look, just take a moment or two to look at them, we see that they're primarily externalities, but they're generally thought of in the public sphere as short-termism issues, and occasionally in our analytic sphere as time horizon issues as opposed to externalities. And then there's confirmation. It's an easy idea to transmit that short-termism is a bad thing. There are interests that sincerely believe that short-termism is wide, rampant, and bad, who have reason to push the idea forward. So diagrammatically, it's something like this. On the left-hand side is in blue is our core idea for stock market short-termism. It's to what extent is the corporation favoring current results over long-term profits? Social degradation can feed into the calculation, in that social degradation is relevant. Damage to the environment and damage to the planet is important if it comes back to bite the corporation in the long run. But if it never comes back to bite the corporation, if the corporation never has to pay the price for its current pollution and its current contribution to climate change, then it's a pernicious issue that needs to be dealt with. But it's not primarily a corporate time horizon issue. It's an externalization of the problem from the corporation. So a little bit more detail on each leg of the thesis. Why is stock market short-termism something that's not accorded just local treatment like the appraisal remedy? And the idea we're pushing forward in this paper is that it's got very favorable selling characteristics. Its connotation and its imagery fits. So this is kind of the core image of what's going on in the stock market. Probably even those of us who've spent decades thinking about corporate governance still have a residue of this image, and this is much more vivid to the public. I mean, these guys don't have a time horizon that's going much further or maybe any further than the closing bell of the day. And it just seems intuitive that A, the stock market is short term, and B, that short term is bad. Then there's going to be a whole lot of confirmation by repetition of this easy to repeat, easy to imagine idea. There are interests that have reason to repeat it and to believe it. And then there's a lot of category confusion. There are a whole lot of things out there that are 3/4 of the way externalities, but they're seen as primarily being due to short-termism. So I said I'd say something about Joe Biden's view. So I am quite confident, without knowing for sure, that Joe Biden is not studying the Journal of Finance and the corporate law reviews on a nightly basis. But he nevertheless has quite strong opinions about stock market short-termism. And his definitional notion of short-termism is congruent with the one we put forward, that companies are foregoing the long run to boost near-term stock price. And it's not just a technical issue, it's one of the greatest threats to America's enduring prosperity. And when you dig just a couple of sentences further, it's the idea that this is shortchanging workers in a serious way. Why does this have public traction with the public? It can't be the academic data just on its own, because, as I say, the academic data is quite divided on this. But this three-legged analysis of connotation, confirmation, and category confusion can help us get there or analyze the problem a little deeper. And I'll talk just a moment more about two of these issues and then turn this over to Roy. One is the connotation. Short-termism is bad, and the initial view of short-termism that most people have is that it indicates that the speaker, if I'm accused of being short-term, I will take it as a diss, because it usually means that somebody is saying that I'm erratic, that I'm unstable, that I can't stick to a plan. Conversely, if somebody says that I'm long-term, even after writing this up, I'll still probably take this as a compliment. It'll indicate that I'm loyal, that I'm strategic, that I can make a plan and I can stick to it. Yet there are quite similar sensibilities that if we just pushed a little bit more, we would think of these as being time constrained. It's only in the near future that this is going to manifest itself, but a positive. So if somebody is flexible, adaptable, can change based on new evidence, is attuned to what's going on around them, this is really a constricted time horizon, but we tend to think of those things as positive. Similarly, for the long term, if we said that somebody is stubborn, pig-headed, or that the board is stubborn and pig-headed and does not see changes in the market over the long term, I think we would say that these are negative aspects of being long-term. Yet the first reactions are the reactions that people tend to have. Short-termism is bad, long-termism is good, and Daniel Kahneman's famous dichotomy between thinking fast and slow, we think applies here, in that the initial reaction is short-termism bad, long-termism good, and it's only when we think about it a little bit more that we see some neutrality in the aspect. As I say, some of our current empirics are quite supportive of this. We do have in the paper a look at all the major dictionaries, and the major dictionaries are in this genre. Short-termism embeds a negative connotation in the dictionaries. It's giving up something of significance in the long term for current satisfaction. And long-termism, conversely, is uniformly seen as somewhere between neutral and good. Second category to talk about before I turn this over to Roy is we've already mentioned this, is there are a whole lot of things that are labeled short-term quickly, but upon analysis are primarily, say, externalities. So environmental degradation. Large firms could degrade the environment in the long term and the short term, and constantly find that degradation is profitable for the corporation. This is pernicious, and I'm kind of a green person. I want to have this taken care of, but altering the firm's time, the individual firm's time horizons is probably a quite poor remedy for environmental degradation. We need other things to internalize the externality, a carbon tax, for example. The way this feeds in is that if in the public imagination or the lawmaker's imagination, lots of things that look pernicious, like disrespect for employees, excessive financial risk-taking, environmental degradation, and climate change are seen as pure firm time horizons, or primarily firm time horizons, instead of externalities, we will tend to adopt and be favorable towards thinking that will change the time horizon of the corporation when it'll have only a tangential and maybe no impact on the harm that we want to cure. But we will think of stock market short-termism as bigger because we see more pernicious things, and we attribute those pernicious things to short-termism in the corporation and the stock market. So let me turn this over to Roy to talk about confirmation, interest groups, and the overview of the issues. Roy?
Thank you, Mark. So let's see if I got this. All right. So the third vector that makes the short-termism narrative so powerful is confirmation and repetition. So we know that repetition fosters belief, and here we have repetition coming from multiple angles. We have repetition coming from what Mark just described, meaning that our environment constantly cues this idea of short-termism to us. If you're an executive, a regulator, financial journalist, you constantly hear about the short-termism problem, you think it's a huge problem. But besides this naturally occurring repetition, there's also interest-driven repetition. And this is the point that I want to focus on for the remainder of this presentation. Because up till now, Mark has focused on how the short-termism idea is good at pushing itself. It's like a meme in the internet. It has favorable selling characteristics. But I want to focus on how the idea is also being pushed by strong interests that benefit from it being popular. For example, one interest group that benefits from widespread belief in short-termism is corporate managers. Because if everything that is bad with corporate behavior can be easily attributed to stock market-driven short-termism, a potential solution would be let's insulate managers from stock market pressures. So to illustrate this point, what we did is we ran a content analysis of all the corporate governance blog posts of a prominent law firm that represents corporate managers, all the posts in which they invoked short-termism. And we found that in almost every time that they invoke short-termism, they do it within a specific context. They do it within a call for action, further insulate managers. So they would say something like, there's rampant short-termism, and so let's switch to electing directors every 5 years instead of annually. There's rampant short-termism, and so let's reduce the frequency of reporting, and so on and so forth. So again, it's a very specific context. It's not just about diagnosing the problem. It's also, indeed, it's more so about coming up with a specific solution that also tend to favor managers. So they could have lobbied for these measures even without saying short-termism, but that would be a losing proposition. To think about it, if managers and their allies would write comment letters to the SEC or would go to the media and say something like, we don't want to be subject to market pressures anymore, or we want to have less accountability, then they would probably not get what they want. But once you couch it within the framework of let us help society solve this economy-wide problem, your chances are becoming better. Maybe time to take a slight step back and just to clarify, it's not that we think that managers and their allies lie. It's actually most managers truly believe, sincerely believe that there's a huge problem of short-termism, partly due to their own biases, to their own managerial biases. So for example, it's well recognized that top managers are over-optimistic and overconfident. And so whenever someone comes to them and tells them, you need to drop this ambitious project of yours because it bleeds money, they view this valuable market feedback as a sign of short-sightedness. So our point is not that managers repeat this idea as a hoax. Our point is that the powerful narrative allows managers to sell their position to the outside world, allows them to form coalitions, which brings us to the next point. Managers are not the only group that benefit from widespread belief in short-termism. Think, for example, about politicians who want to cater to certain labor interests or environmental interests. They can benefit as well from invoking short-termism. To illustrate this point, we also ran a content analysis. Only this time we searched major newspapers in Factiva for mentions of US senators or US presidential candidates invoking the concept of stock market-driven short-termism. And here what we found is that they invoke it in a very different context than the managers do. When they invoke it, it's usually to decry how short-termism hurts stakeholders group. And when they talk about policy implications, when they talk about the cure, they talk about things such as, let's put labor representatives on the board as they do in Germany, or things like that, right? So they almost never talk about let's insulate managers from market feedback. In other words, this idea, the stock market-driven short-termism narrative, gets repeated by different groups that have access to the media, but it means different things to these different groups. It's an ideological or rhetorical big tent, if you will, that facilitates these unlikely coalitions. It's good for politicians to invoke this idea because it allows them to criticize capitalism and financial markets without being perceived as socialist, which in the US, it's still not good. So they can say something like, we're not against markets, we're for markets, but there are many problems stemming from the time horizon issues that Mark described. And so we only want to help the market help itself. We want to help the market be great again. And for the managers, it's good to invoke this narrative because it allows them to win even on issues that gain public saliency, which kind of goes against conventional wisdom in political economy model. And this is just general, not just on this topic. And the thinking is that in issues when there is salience in public opinion, it kind of takes away the advantage of narrow interest group, the advantage of incumbent powerful interest, because then politicians will try to cater to wider public preferences. But if the narrow interest group, in this case, the managerial lobby, manages to come up with a powerful narrative that helps them form coalitions with wider groups, they can still win even on issues with public salience. And this brings us, this segues to the implications. This is not just semantics or harmless misdirection. Of course, it can have some implications. And I think the intuitive overarching point is that powerful narrative can crowd out better solutions to underlying problems, okay? So if we have several problems, some problems stemming from information asymmetries, we may want to say incentivize whistleblowers. Some problems stemming from externalities, we may want to, like Mark said, carbon tax or direct regulation. Some problems stemming from market power, we may want tougher antitrust informers and so on and so forth. But if all the problems are collapsed or being seen as part of this stock market driven short-termism, the proposed solutions will likely do very little to solve the underlying issues. So to conclude, very hard to explain on facts alone why the stock market driven short-termism idea is so popular. Well, we've been trying in this paper to offer some hypotheses and some exploratory ways to test them. We're currently going through some hopefully more rigorous empirical ways to test this hypothesis. But the slide that I wanted to leave you with is this one. Because in this paper, we focused only on one narrative. But as Amir and Mark said from the outset, in today's world, 2022, there are other very important corporate law issues that are on the radar, that are on the public agenda, media agenda, political agenda, that they gain saliency. And this means to us that the way that they will be decided is a function not just of the merits, is a function not just of the interest, it's also a function of the power of the narrative. And so the narrative analysis of this kind will be needed on these issues as well. I mean, you can even look at the past example from this slide alone, such as the hostile takeover debate in the 1980s, also very salient, right? And there the narrative dynamics just jump at you from the screen. Think about it. So we have poison pills versus shareholder rights plan, or we have corporate raiders versus shareholder democracy. So it's intuitive to imagine the outsized impact that narrative power had on these debates and the outside impact that it will have on future debate. And with that, I'll turn things over to our highly persuasive discussants. Amir, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry. talking to myself. So I was in the middle of praising Mark and Roy for keeping time, and I will introduce our three discussants together, and then we'll move from one to the other in a row. The first discussant will be Dr. J.B. Heaton. He's the founder of One Hat Research, which is an independent financial analytics consulting firm. JB provides expert opinions in cases involving issues in law and finance, including climate finance and ESG. Next will be Professor Elizabeth Pollman. She's co-director of the Institute of Law and Economics at PenU. Her academic expertise, also known, I think, to most participants here, lies in the areas of corporate law, corporate governance, as well as startups, venture capital, and entrepreneurship. And the third will be Eleazer Klein. Eli is the chair of the M&A and Securities Group and co-chair of the Global Shareholder Activism Group at Schulte, Roth, and Zabel firm. He practices in the area of shareholder activism, mergers and acquisitions, securities law, and regulatory compliance. JB, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is it's an exciting opportunity for me because I followed this paper when it came out. I read it very closely. It's obviously a topic that's near and dear to a lot of hearts, including mine. I want to start off this discussion of Mark and Roy's paper with, and I don't know if you can everybody see that or not? It looks like it's cut off. Okay. On mine, it's cut off. Okay. So with what I'd call the seminar version of sort of my summary of the paper, and I'm going to sort of deadpan it for a reason here. The writers and interest groups use language choice and red herring arguments to create appealing narratives that make short-termism seem important when the evidence suggests otherwise. So I think that's a reasonable summary of the paper. Now I want to give you the narrative version. Two honest law professors who uncover the secret power of a cabal of greedy executives and their government cronies must draw on their specialized skills to save the free world's economy. Narrative works. Story is more interesting than statement. And this is, I think, just a fundamental human truth. So let me go to here to Act 1. For what kinds of argument is narrative most important? And let me set up just a small conflict here, small because I am probably about as sympathetic a reader of this paper as one could imagine. But there's a small line, not particularly important to the argument, that an analytically strong argument on the merits can fail if it lacks an underlying persuasive narrative. Now, let me propose kind of an alternative here, which is that a factually weak argument will fail if it lacks an underlying persuasive narrative. And indeed, if an idea is popular in the absence of factual evidence, it probably has a powerful narrative. There's an interesting paper from 2019 by a couple of marketing researchers about when and whether facts introduced into a narrative make the proposal, essentially the proposition, more or less persuasive. And what they find is that if you have weak facts, narrative makes your proposition more convincing. But if you have strong facts, narrative tends to diminish the persuasiveness of your proposition relative to essentially a listing of the facts alone. And I think this is interesting in sort of how we see narratives competing out there. I would go further than the authors and say that there's not an even split between the long term and the short term and the empirical evidence. There's basically no good evidence, in my opinion, that corporations act in the short term. Now, there's not as much narrative on the other side, just because I think for those of us who think there's no evidence on the short term, maybe you don't do that research. But once you start engaging in the narrative, it's an interesting question to ask whether, based on this research about whether when narrative helps an argument and when it doesn't, whether those of us on the long-term side kind of hurt ourselves by engaging in a narrative analysis when we have strong facts on our side. Act 2. So if we have these narratives out there with weak factual support, why is that? What's the relation between problems and these narratives that have weak factual support? Well, I want to propose that narratives with weak evidence don't make problems. Problems sometimes require narratives, and they require them when the evidence is weak. And what I mean here is that we probably don't want to think about a bunch of narratives sprouting out in the world. There are strong ones and weak ones, and when they're strong, they have good benefits, and when they're weak, they create problems. I think instead there are problems out there that when the evidence is ambiguous or not on your side, you need a narrative to move toward your goal. Now, the goal here in the short-termism debate, I think, as the authors put it really well, is kind of twofold. For some, it is the diversion of corporate resources from investors to other stakeholders. And that might be environmentalists, that might be workers, that might be the agenda of social justice advocates. But the goal is, how can I move some of those resources and that corporate partition away from investors and over to my preferred constituencies? The second, as the authors suggest, is the insulation of managers. Managers want not to be questioned, especially if they don't want to sell their company, but also if they don't want their strategies to be questioned. There's an interesting symbiosis here where these different groups want different things, but they both have goals. And I think that the narrative helps them organize and discipline their message. And that if we look at the narratives for their truth value, we kind of can miss the fact that that's not really what they're doing. They're really trying to organize and cooperate on a goal. They don't have evidence. Narrative becomes much more important. Finally, Act 3 here in my comments is the generality of the short-term and long-term narrative issues. So the Mark and Roy are, I think, modest in their paper in saying that each problem that has a narrative should be addressed on its own in its own context, and certainly that's going to be true. But even in addition to and beyond, I think, that list that Roy gave there at the end, the world is full of narratives that, and the authors kind of hit on this. They mentioned religion at one point, but the world is full of these short-term, long-term narratives. So if you do the difficult thing X now, the future will be wonderful. But if you do the easy thing Y now, the future will be horrible. Now, my two best friends, Alon Brav and my wife Katie, persuaded me not to go through a list of examples so that I don't offend everyone in the last 30 seconds. And so I won't go through them, but I think you can think to yourself, if you think to yourself about something that's controversial and that really fires people up, there's very often a short-term, long-term aspect to this. And I think that's why this paper, not only addressing this topic that's really near and dear to our hearts, will end up being cited not just in corporate law, but I think maybe as lawyers and those who do work in the kind of the law journals and the peer-reviewed law work are going to be citing this paper, I think, more broadly for its kind of first step, kind of across the threshold, so to speak, into a much wider, much bigger issue about human narrative. So I love the paper, as you can tell.
Perfect. Thank you, JB. Elizabeth, you're next.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss the excellent article by Professors Mark Rowe and Roy Shapira. As we've heard, the article explores the role of narrative with the example of short-termism, and they argue that the concept of stock market short-termism has three strong qualities that make its narrative power formidable. One, connotation; two, category confusion; and three, confirmation. And they argue that this has happened with that concept of short-termism despite weak or mixed academic evidence. And the concern is that narratives like this can drive out good policymaking. So for example, if the real problem with corporate pollution or carbon footprint is externalities instead of short-termism, then the better policy response would be a carbon tax than a measure that insulates managers from shareholders and market pressures. So I'd like to just start by noting that I think it's terrific to give more attention to the social, cultural, and political dynamics that are at play in corporate law and policymaking. As Rowe and Shapira point out, this can be fuzzy, but it is of utmost importance in understanding real-world influence that can shape public perceptions and policymakers' actions, as well as judicial doctrine and more. And in a somewhat similar vein, in a recent article with Dorothy Lund, we explored how law, institutions, and culture shape the system of corporate governance in the US. And I think the concept of culture is also indeed somewhat fuzzy, but important as it encompasses the social transmission of ideas, and we see this reflected in media and politics. And as somebody in particular who did undergraduate studies in anthropology before coming to law, I often think in terms of broader idea of culture, but narrative seems to be universal, or a nearly universal human approach to making sense of the world and transmitting information, ideas, an account of connected events, or in short, a story. So what they do really is inject the narrative approach into the corporate law literature, in which others have discussed things like symbols and myths, like Marcel Cahan and Ed Rock, Jonathan Macy, as well as others who have examined related ideas like Claire Hill about categorization and identity theory and more. So they make a contribution to the literature on corporate law and narrative, but also to the literature on short-termism, or more broadly, time horizons, and whether there's actually wrong-termism, to use Andrew Verstein's phrase. So I'd like to offer 3 points of additional discussion in response to the piece today. First, and some of these are discussions, some are just questions, but I've grouped them into 3. So the first one is on the nature of evidence and its relationship to narrative. So Rowe and Shapira note that the evidence that stock market-driven short-termism is seriously damaging the economy is inconclusive and contested. And they suggest that where there is some evidence, but of a conclusive or inconclusive or contested nature, there's room for narrative to take hold. So that raises for me a few questions or subpoints. One, on the definitions and relationship between evidence and narrative. So I wonder, is evidence in this account an objective fact or truth, and narrative is a social construct created to serve an interest? In the Rowe and Shapira account, it seems that evidence is what truly exists as objective fact, and then narrative has some truth or factual support, but it goes beyond that into storytelling. And then that would contrast, it would seem, with myths, which could be debunked and maybe entirely unsupported. But I wonder, when I read this, could narrative instead be capable of telling us something factual about the world that is otherwise hard to measure? So for example, could it be that narrative is constructed to make sense of something in the world? This is how humans this is how we live, is through narrative. And so starting from individuals' perception of others' behavior, or even from more specifically, managers' own experience, for example, in feeling pressure around quarterly earnings per share guidance, or the imprecision of discount rates, and then narrative flows from that. So the narrative actually does tell us something perhaps rooted in experience of the world, even before researchers study the phenomenon to see if there is evidence. A second kind of related point, what are we to think about narrative and its potential scope in a time in which many papers have shown empirical corporate governance studies to be, some of them, flawed, difficult to do well, or at least most of the time leading to inconclusive results? It seems most things in corporate governance are often supported by weak evidence. So what does that mean for the role of narrative? So that's my first set of points or questions on the nature of evidence and the relationship to narrative. Second, some comments and questions on historical context and the claim of increasing importance of narratives. So in the article, Rowe and Shapira say that, quote, historically, the plumbing of corporate and securities law rarely engaged public sentiment. But in our era of increasing populism and burgeoning social media, popular narrative, widespread perception, and notions of how will it play in the media are becoming increasingly important in corporate lawmaking. So I'm not sure about the historical and directional claims. It seems corporate and securities law and business regulation more broadly have engaged public sentiment in the past and likely wasn't rare. A few years ago, Margaret Blair and I co-authored a contribution to a Tobin Project volume published by Harvard University Press that was called Corporations in American Democracy, co-edited by Naomi Lamoureux and Bill Novak. And one of the big things that I actually learned from doing that project and getting to work with the other contributors, many of them historians and economic historians, was that the history of corporations in the US has always involved policy making about corporations that's been the subject of public debates about the role of corporations. And it's often captured the public, and there's been various narratives. And so, for example, there's been at least 3 times that there's been significant public debates about federalizing corporate charters. In the late 1800s, in the Gilded Age, there was lots of public sentiment around narratives of the octopus and the need for trust busting. The early 1900s scandals on corporate political contributions that gave rise to the Tillman Act that Adam Winkler has written about. The period around the 1930s and the debate about the $1 million executive compensation. Harwell Wells has a good good article on that topic, and the narrative that no man can be worth $1 million a year, etc. So Rowe and Shapira acknowledge the importance of narrative that's not new. But I think it would be a really interesting avenue to explore the history of this and whether it's in fact increasing related to trends of populism or social media and how that works, what that connection is. So I wonder if that itself actually might be a story that we tell about increasing importance of narrative and populism, when actually narrative is pervasive throughout history. And then 3, finally, my third set of comments is just about applying what you're finding to other issues and narratives, which it seems like is your intuition as well. I wonder what your account tells us about other concepts and narratives in the moment of corporate law. What happens when there are competing narratives? So for example, it seems looking in the past few decades, there's been competing narratives about the bad effects from shareholder primacy, shareholder activists, vulture capitalists, et cetera. But it's competing with narratives about the stock market as the economy and citizens as shareholders because they participate in 401ks and pension funds, and they see shareholders as owning the corporation, et cetera. So there's competing narratives sometimes, and I wonder what you do with that. I also wonder about these current concepts like sustainability or social responsibility or ESG. So to take corporate sustainability, for example, and run it through your 3 points. On connotation, sustainability would seem to have positive connotation for most people. I'm not sure about category confusion. Perhaps it's similar and related to short-termism. Is the problem time horizons or actually externalities? Confirmation. Corporate sustainability is an easy idea to communicate, and it is regularly repeated, I think. So does that mean it's catching on and more popular? And then what does that tell us about the public policy debate? And I wonder, does narrative always tend to lead us astray regarding policymaking debates? How far would this analysis take us ultimately in understanding other significant narratives with corporate law implications at the time? So to recap, I'm really thankful for the opportunity to comment on this really excellent and thought-provoking article that makes a contribution to 2 literatures, one on narrative and corporate law and another on short-termism. And I would just offer some thoughts and questions about the nature of evidence and its relationship to narrative and historical context and whether this is increasingly important, and then extensions and applications. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. We go directly to Ellie.
So I echo everyone from before and really appreciating the opportunity to talk about this. I'm not the academic on these panels. My father was a professor. I'm jealous and probably want to become a professor at some point in my life, but I'm not. I bring a practical bent to this conversation as a practicing lawyer, particularly someone who has seen a lot of the issues raised. I have to tell you, just as a lead-in, this paper really resonated tremendously with me and excited me, because a lot of the issues that were written about in this paper put something concrete around the things that I've been speaking about at many panels I've spoken about, law schools and business schools and other places where I get to play professor for a few minutes at a time. And it's something that has hit me for a while. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of a practical bent of what I've seen over the last decades plus, as well as talk about what's currently happening in the regulatory landscape, which I think shows you both a plus and a negative in terms of, I'm a bit biased admittedly, in terms of how the narrative is playing out in the actual legislative landscape currently as we're speaking. So to begin with, I've seen this concept of the effect of connotation and confirmation through repetition in a real way. I've seen a lot of the things that Professor Ole started off with at the beginning, where we've seen the progression from discussions about the evils of hostile takeovers to the problems with buybacks, and that's even led to recent legislation finally. So I've seen the real world implications and applications of these concepts as they come about. And I can't tell you how strongly I feel that this concept of narrative is so effective and so much a part of the landscape all the time that I see. When I speak on panels, I say this partially as a joke, partially in jealousy, frankly. I sit in panels with some of the institutions, law firms, and the like that were mentioned in the paper and were mentioned previously in the presentation. And I almost feel, and I've literally done this, where I'm on panel with some of my colleagues who I'm very good friends with from those firms, and I'll say, you know what, I know what you're going to do. Can I just say your speech for you? And I literally can spit it out almost verbatim. It's like sort of a tape recorder, you push play. And it's very effective when you keep staying to narrative and you keep repeating the effects of short-termism and the evils of it. It resonates, it catches on. There was something as a practical thing recently. The Tulane had a conference where they do an annual corporate governance conference and M&A conference. And Ted Yu, who is the chief of the Office of Mergers and Acquisitions in the Division of Corporation Finance at the SEC, he always speaks on a panel annually at this conference. And at the conference, one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a moment that came up is the fact that the SEC has now proposed to shorten the reporting threshold timeframe for beneficial ownership in the public markets. It's currently 10 days. It's a proposal by the SEC that's subject to comment now for 5 days. And he said, every year I come here and every year I sit in this panel, and every year the people who are coming from one side of the spectrum keep saying to me, 10 days is too long, 10 days too long. Well, we finally have proposed something to shorten it. And it, to me, when I heard that, it's like, wait 1 second. What happened to the question about whether you should be shorting? Does it have to be shorter or it doesn't have to? Isn't that the question? The fact that one side of the spectrum is complaining about the fact that it's evil, it's too long, we can shorten it, that really isn't the right metric to be testing in determining whether you should be shortening a reporting time frame. But yet, that's exactly what resonated. And he took pride in saying, look, I think we finally have done this. I'm not taking sides. I'll talk about it in a minute in terms of how I feel about that particular proposal. But it just shows you how strong the narrative is and the repetition is in terms of what it can accomplish. So to give you just a little bit of perspective is, look, I have somebody who prides myself in trying to be fair in terms of how I approach things. I primarily represent the investor side of the community in terms of what I do for a living. Therefore, I tend to represent the activists on the spectrum much more, the people who are against the narrative about short-termism. But nonetheless, I'm never have advocated or claimed that all activism is good, meaning I don't claim that there's not things that are wrong, that are short-term, and that's incorrect way of approaching things. What I'm against is an absolute statement, which, as the professors lay out so magnificently in the paper, does not have any real support to it. So the repetition and the constant claim about the evils of short-termism is just something that's trying to drive a result. And the fact of whether or not it has any support becomes irrelevant. I'm a person who believes in justice. I believe very strongly in right and wrong. That bothers me. To keep repeating a point and not say it's my opinion, it's my view, but to claim it's definitely right when you cannot show any compelling support for it. You may be able to show papers, but you at least have to concede there's an equal number of papers on the other side of the equation, which at best, as Professors Rowe and Shapira point out, tell you there's really no clear answer from the academic literature on this. It bothers me a lot. And I always use as a great example, I live in a condo co-op in Manhattan, which has its own board of directors by definition. And a few years ago, and it's a well-run building, they decided to make all the directors up for 2 years, called what we call a staggered board, as opposed to be up annually. And the reasoning that was given is that we just don't want to have disruption and have a tremendous turnover in a building like ours at any one time. And it struck me at that point that, again, the concept of short-termism and disruption, it keeps striking home. This is a building that's never had a problem about turnover in the board. There's no turnover in the near term. And the fact that people want to resign because they were leaving the building, they could anyway. But nonetheless, the narrative is so powerful. Oh, we need to make sure the stability, that it's convincing to a lot of people that we don't want disruption. Short-termism is bad. We need to protect ourselves. And that type of thing passes despite the fact there's no support. If you actually think about it, what it does is it insulates boards, it insulates people from having to be responsible for things. So what's the example, just to give you, of what I've seen recently? I mentioned before that the SEC has two things that I want to talk about. One is they've proposed to shorten the reporting window for beneficial ownership. When you cross 5% ownership, you need to publicly file a 13D. It's currently 10 calendar days. They proposed to shorten it to 5 days. I mentioned to you that Ted Yu talked about it and said, oh, people have been complaining. And why I think this sort of goes directly to what the paper is getting at is that the concept of having to shorten it comes from the belief that there is a short-term focus on shareholders. They're trying to get a pop in a stock. They're not in there for the long term. We need to make sure the markets know about it sooner rather than later. And it's the buy-in to the narrative. It's buy-in to the connotation, the confirmation that has been out there literally by a lot of the firms and papers that the professors cite that led to the SEC finally proposing. That they talked about proposing a number of years ago. We were able to push them off by showing what is it that you're trying to do. Finally, the proposal came, and the proposal is to shorten it. It's a subject to comment. There's a lot of pushback that's going to take place, that is taking place. We don't know the end of the story at this point. But what showed is in that thing is that the SEC was buying into the narrative. First of all, it's not clear that there's any basis to claim that one shareholder is entitled to know sooner than other shareholders about when somebody has crossed a threshold. Remember, if I'm the buyer, it's my information. Why are people entitled to know it? Well, the entitlement comes if you believe, oh, this is something that I'm doing wrong. I have a short-term focus. Therefore, we need to fix the problem. But you're not looking about whether, in fact, there is a problem to begin.
I need to be a short-termist. I apologize. So wrapping up.
Okay. So I'll just say that that's a prime example. On the flip side of it, you have the environmental proposal, which shows that, I think, a good thing by focusing on the need for reporting, that the SEC has, in fact, put forward some proposals as a result of it. But just to wrap up and keep us on schedule, I will say that I see in the real world some concrete examples I've given you that the power of this narrative is unbelievable. It really resonates. It resonates with regulators, it resonates with academics, it resonates with corporate America. And that's what I loved about this paper, how it brings to the forefront the concept that we've been speaking about in a practical sense and highlights the problems with not identifying what's right and wrong, but instead sticking to a narrative.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. So we can talk about this topic, for a long time, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, so we will give Professor Mark Rowe and Roy Shapira some time to respond to the comments. And also the authors promised to respond to the questions through emails.
Do we have 2
Roy
minutes?
has
or
some
1 minute?
comments, and then I have a slide.
All right, sure. So we'll do it 2 minutes, I guess. 1 minute each in the tag team. So thanks a lot. All the comments were fantastic. Really, seriously. So one sentence version response to each. JB, just the point about facts can win without powerful narratives, or narratives only needed when you're weak on the facts. I think it downplays a little bit the role of agenda setting. What's on the agenda? What gets to be on the agenda? Facts can win alone when they're on the agenda. They cannot win when they're not on the agenda to begin with. Elizabeth, agree on the nature of evidence, agree on the history aspects. It's most things. History is not straight line, but rather cyclical. On the competing, on what we see today, I think the point that we will make on today's issue is that it takes a narrative to beat a narrative. Once one group in the debate comes up with this powerful narrative, it pushes the other groups to couch their ideas or what they want to say in a powerful narrative as well. And Ellie, I mean, to your points about the practical experience sitting with these lawyers, when Mark and I began researching this paper, we were curious to see when exactly this narrative started. And we saw that it was started by Martin Lipton in 1979. And then when you do the Google Ngrams, when you do like the frequency, when do you see peaks of all these mentions of stock market driven short-termism throughout the history, to go to Elizabeth's point, you see peaks along turmoils or areas, points in time where you have a lot of public discussion of corporate misbehavior, beginning of the 80s, end of the 80s, beginning of 2000, financial crisis, and then the last few years. So that's it for me, Mark.
So these are great comments. Wish we had them before we had finished the paper, but since we're still working in the area, they're great comments because we think our initial reaction, I hope this isn't Kahneman fast thinking, is that these are things that could enrich but wouldn't lead us to give up the core thesis. Particularly like Elizabeth's comment about narrative analysis being much more important historically than we gave it credit for, because then this makes narrative analysis even more important. We may have to delete that sentence or qualify it in the future. And there's an aspect that I think Elizabeth is 100%. We academics can be subject to our own narratives as to what we think is good work and good evidence for a subject, and we shouldn't eliminate that. Let me close. There's more that we really should talk about, but we don't have an hour. We have a few seconds. Let me close with. I'm going to try to share a slide that our super research assistant, Denise Hahn, put together from the surveys that we're doing. And this may not end all debate on the issue, but we see this as significant. So this is a generalized survey, and you should see the slide. Do you see a slide? Okay, so first question is, Board of Directors is considering candidates. A conscientious board, the big 55% on the left, will pick somebody who's flexible and reject somebody who's rigid. What we thought was a somewhat similar question is, should the board pick somebody who is short-term, which we tend to associate with flexibility? No. Should we pick somebody who is long-term, who could be associated with a negative connotation on long-term, namely rigid? Yes. Similar terms, very different reaction. More work needs to be done, but this is suggestive to us that there's something deep lying down there in the way issues get framed in the public sphere. So thank you all for listening to us. Thanks in particular to the commentators and to the organizers for giving us the opportunity to talk about our issue, our narrative for an hour.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Roy. Thanks very much to the commentators, JB, Elizabeth, and Ellie. See you in the next Spotlight event, which will be in the finance series. See you.